So we are going to be taking ourselves through 1943. And we're going to be taking it in particular from the 23rd of October to the 4th of July. And don't worry, I'll be taking you on a tour around the various fronts so that you know where we're starting from. But one thing that I'm going to say, I want to be very clear, because the topic is huge. When I started this topic, when they said to me in 2019, could you do a Second World War series? I said, yes, but we'll concentrate only really on the European theatre. We won't cover the fighting in the East. And so if you were hoping for an in-depth summary of the Japanese conflict, I'm afraid you'll be very disappointed tonight, because I'm not really going to be mentioning it. That's so that I can actually finish in time for us all to be able to go to the pub. And I know that we'd all appreciate that very much. I will occasionally mention the Far Eastern Front, as you can't entirely disentangle them. But I will be focused on the fighting in Europe, in Africa, and in the Atlantic. And so let's take a quick look at the situation that we currently find ourselves. So it's the 23rd of October, 1942. And I called this talk, initially, Germany's Fading Chances. But then I soon changed the title, but the adverts had gone out, so I was committed to really the Reich in retreat, as the chance of Germany being able to win this war, if Germany indeed ever could have won this war, has by now gone. The question now is, how will this war end? It will not end, and it cannot end, as long as the British, the Russians, and the Americans stay united and keep their nerve. Then it cannot end in a German victory. Diplomatically, the Germans might be able to rescue something from what is now a train wreck of a campaign. And if they can try and drive a wedge between the Western democracies and Russia, they might be able to rescue something from the situation. But the idea that Germany now can beat the combination of the British Empire, Russia, and America is, I'm afraid, a fool's hope. However, of course, when it comes to strategy, a fool is in charge indeed. And so let's see where the fighting is. Well, the German armies have reached Stalingrad, and they are in Stalingrad. And as far as they are concerned, they own the city. They own all of the city, except for a tiny strip of land against the river Volga. To all intents and purposes, the city is theirs, but a small number of Russian soldiers are still grimly hanging on, keeping the German Sixth Army trapped in the shattered ruins of Stalingrad. Germany is not without allies. Obviously, in the Far East there is Japan. Italy is a beaten power. They hadn't really wished to join the war. However, in 1940, the war had seemed won. And so they joined the war, hoping to be able to sit at the victor's table and take some of the rewards of victory. They were genuinely shocked that the British had decided to fight on. And the British have inflicted on both land and at sea a series of stunning and humiliating defeats upon the Italians. They have definitely lost this war, but they are trapped, chained into this war by their overmighty ally, Germany. And of course, there are a series of minor allies: Finland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Slovakians, the Croat fascist party. There's a whole host of small European countries that have allied themselves with the German cause. But of course, perhaps the major one of these is Vichy France. The French have sided, although I know the French now tell themselves about the Free French, and indeed there was a Free French movement. There was also, however, a large number of Frenchmen who fought for Vichy France against Britain. And if you were with me last year, and I think it was approximately a year ago, we looked at the fighting between the British and the French in the Mediterranean, in Syria, and it has to be said that for much of the war, more Frenchmen had died fighting the British than had died fighting the Germans, as they tried to keep hold of their empire, in the hope that if Germany does win, they can replace Italy as Germany's main ally and will get rewarded for for their loyalty they have shown in fighting the British. And of course, also, the French are absolutely furious with us, because we had abandoned them, as far as they were concerned, in 1940 by scuttling off those beaches. And then, to make things worse, we had near destroyed their fleet at Mers el Kabir. As their fleet lay in port, we had hammered that fleet. We had crippled many of their warships, killing thousands of French servicemen, just to make sure that those warships weren't handed over to Nazi Germany. It was a necessary thing to do. We'd asked that French fleet to sail to Britain so that we could impound them, and quite frankly, we'd have almost certainly have nicked it had they done so, because those warships were excellent. However, those French servicemen would have lived, so it's a bit of a case of swings and roundabouts for those French servicemen. They decided not to sail those ships to Britain. They decided to leave them somewhere where the Germans could take them, and so, I'm afraid, tragically, those young Frenchmen lost their lives to British shells. In a bombardment led by the HMS Hood, of course, before it went on for its date with destiny with the Bismarck. And so we have a host of nations allied with Germany. Germany has lost its paratroop formation in the invasion of Crete, including a lot of its air transports. Its army has swept into Egypt, and when we left our talk, the fighting in the desert had reached a little-known railway station called El Alamein, deep into Egypt. Now, the British should have been able to win the Desert War before, of course, in 1942. However, as was said last year, never had a campaign been fought so badly as the fighting that led up to our retreat to El Alamein. And so we return to the 23rd of October, 1942, and the start of our talk. Germany is starving. It is short of raw materials. It is certainly short of men. However, on the map, all seems well, for it has carved itself a huge European empire. Now, the German Sixth Army, the largest and best equipped of the German armies, is pinned in the city of Stalingrad as they try to grind the Russians out. They are also trying to drive upon the Baku oil fields, which is at that stage one of the largest oil fields in the world, deep in the Caucasus. In the Atlantic, for the first time, U-boats have started to enter the Atlantic in large numbers. I know we like to have this vision that Germany started the war with hundreds of U-boats everywhere, and I'm sure that to the British merchantmen it seemed that way. They'd started the war with 8 serviceable U-boats, and they'd done huge damage with those 8. But by now, there is actually a decent number of U-boats in the Atlantic, really for the first time in the war. In the skies over Europe, the British and the Americans have begun their efforts to bomb Germany into submission. It won't be a repeat of 1939 when we started dropping leaflets, what a waste of heavy bombers that is, on German cities. We are now just going to try and remove German cities from the map. In Africa, the German and Italians have struck deep into Egypt, but a new commander has been sent out to take command of the British Desert Army, a General Montgomery. The Axis war effort is already, however, crippled with shortages of men, food, fuel, and raw materials. And it's also, despite what we like to think of the Nazi war economy, their war effort is riddled with hideous inefficiencies. Germany, Italy, and Vichy France all deeply distrust each other. And Hitler deeply distrusts his own generals. There is no real hope of an Axis victory. But the question we're going to look at throughout the year of 1943, will they be able to force the Allies to accept a stalemate? Will they be able to inflict such damage upon the Allies that now the cost of victory is simply too high? Will they be able to reach a negotiated peace and hold on to some of their conquests in Europe? And so we start our story here. It is the eve of the Battle of El Alamein, Operation Lightfoot. The front line is 40 miles long. You can't, unlike most of the desert battles, you can't just swing to the south because of what is an unusually large sinkhole of sand, the depression. And so for 40 miles, that front line, the Germans have heavily fortified. They have laid thousands of anti-tank mines along those 40 miles. And behind those anti-tank mines are mile after mile of barbed wire. Monty's plan is to punch 2 holes in the Axis lines. The main one is to be in the north, near the coast. A second one is to be in the south. Now, the German lines are strongest in the north, but that's where we're determined that we are going to take them on. We are going to grab and we are going to crush the German Africa Korps head on. 30 Corps was to advance, at least the plan was for them to advance, 3 to 5 miles only, and to reach what they called the Oxalic line. The Oxalic line is just a point 3 to 5 miles beyond the front line. That is our target for the start of El Alamein. And we're to reach it in each advance in 3 columns. Now, these columns, it's incredibly brave how the British engineers had marked them out. At night, British engineers had gone into no man's land, risking the mines and the machine guns, and they had cleared away the minefields in these 3 little columns for each of the 2 advanced lines. These columns are only 8 yards wide. For the younger people, unlike me, the younger people, a yard is roughly a meter. I mean, there's going to be a lot of people going, no, it's a couple of inches out. It's rough. When I say yard, think meter. For these kind of distances, it'll be okay. So an 8-yard wide path. And the advance is to go down these 3 8-yard wide little tunnels of cleared mines to reach the enemy lines. Now, obviously, because we're going to be advancing while being shot at, I sometimes struggle to walk in a straight line when I'm just walking to the lavatory, quite frankly. And so it is dangerous to try and have such a narrow line. But to clear the minefields is dangerous work. The wider it is, the more dangerous it is to be able to do it. And so it needs to be clearly marked out at night, because the tanks are going to rush across these 8-yard wide columns in the sand. And then they will hold, once they've rushed across no man's land, in these narrow columns, the tanks will then, because we know the Germans will counterattack, the tanks will hold off the counterattacking panzers while the infantry come along to try and join up with the tanks. And we will then engage them there. The infantry will, what we call, crumble the German lines by slowly inching our way forwards. While in the south, to make sure the Germans can't concentrate on our main northern advance, the 7th Armoured Division, and what we now call the Fighting French, we've stopped calling them the Free French, we're now referring to them as the Fighting French, in the hope that that will stiffen morale, quite frankly, and also to more clearly differentiate them between the Vichy French forces. So 7th Armoured and the Fighting French will engage and hold the Italians in the south. Now, the key to this is going to be overwhelming firepower. Unfortunately, the Axis have 596 fighters. The Desert Air Force only has 506. And so the Germans and the Italians have more fighter aircraft than we do. And the ones that we have out there, they are not our best. They are mostly the ones the Americans have flogged to us, and a load of Hurricane that we no longer want to use to defend the skies over Britain or Malta. The pilots, the commanders, superb. The junk that we've given them to fly, we could have done better. And they're outnumbered, but they do have an advantage. We know the Germans are desperately short of fuel, ammunition, and spares. So although they have a high number of aircraft, how long are these going to be able to stay serviceable in rapid combat? And so we're going to rely on artillery. We have 908 field guns to face the Axis 200, an overwhelming artillery advantage. And as we are tragically seeing in Ukraine at the moment, it is artillery that will win battles and allow troops to advance. The Ukrainians and the Russians are both trying to use artillery to simply blast holes into each other's lines. And the fire of our artillery has been carefully pre-spotted by the DAF, the Desert Air Force. They have tried to spot those 200 German and Italian guns and to plot fire plans for the British guns to knock out those Axis guns. The first 20 minutes of the attack is going to be counter-battery fire and nothing else. After that, we are going to launch a creeping barrage that will advance 100 yards every 3 minutes. It's a plan that, if you've been to any of my latter First World War talks, will be very familiar to you. It is 1917 all over again. Aircraft spotting for artillery, overwhelming artillery barrage, tanks rumbling forward with infantry trotting behind the tanks, with the engineers clearing obstacles out of the path. It's not innovative. It's not innovative. This is Monty's plan. Nobody's looking at that and going, my God, we've never seen this before. He has not brought an innovative new plan, but what he has offered is firm leadership and careful handling. He doesn't think that you need clever tactics. It is often said that there are two types of officer. There are those that kill more of their own men than the enemy by clever and exciting tactics, and those that can kill more of the enemy than their own by boring but effective tactics. Monty is going for the boring but effective, as opposed to the glamorous and ineffective and costly tactics. And so Monty believes it will take about a week to destroy the German and Italian armies at El Alamein. On the 23rd of October, to the sound of the bagpipes, the attack begins, and the 51st Highland Division go what is literally now over the top into that firestorm to try and take on the Axis forces, with the attack beginning at 10 p.m. And it is absolute chaos. Each path had been pre-marked. Those 3 lanes, remember. The left-hand lane is shown by a sun, put in white tape. So in the sand on white tape is a little sun. In white tape in the middle one is a moon. On the far right one, white tape of a star. What a lovely idea. Unfortunately, there's a huge dust storm. That white tape can't be seen for anything. Also, it turns out some fools dropped a load of artillery shells only a few hundred yards ahead. There's sand everywhere. And so the chance of you seeing any of those beautifully taped out little symbols of suns, moons, and stars, you're in a dream world to be able to see that. Lovely idea, waste of time. And so they start to crawl through the dust. And as the sun rises, what happens? We know what would happen. The German panzers soon counterattack. The British armour is halted, but the infantry manage to crawl forwards. As tanks engage each other over the sands, the British infantry do what British infantrymen always do, slowly advancing through the firestorm. It's not quick. It's not got much in the way of dash. It's got an awful lot of complaining about, and it's got an awful lot of tea being drunk, but it is going forward, and there's not much in the world that's stopping it either. As they grind their way slowly forward, they get to within 2,000 yards, about 2 kilometers, of their target, of the Oxalic line, by the end of the first day of fighting. Now, strangely, all of the senior German officers on this front are absent from the front. And that is really odd, because they knew we were going to be coming. Now, Monty had tried to trick the enemy. He'd actually hired a magician, of all things. He'd seen a bloke on stage. He said, we need to get this bloke. He'd hired a magician to try and fool the Axis with smoke and firecrackers into thinking the attack was going to go elsewhere. But that's not why their commanders were absent, especially as the Axis had correctly guessed the day that we'd attack. They could guess what day we were coming, because we're going to be attacking at night. The British Army like to attack at night. They had done ever really since 1916. We like to go in at night. And so the Germans know that. They've had a few years fighting us by now. They can guess that. And they know that we'll choose the night where there's the most moonlight, so that our troops are less likely to get lost. And so they simply get the weather report. They go, when's the next full moon? They'll come that day, won't they? And indeed we did. And indeed we did. And yet still, despite that, that's the day their senior leadership decided not to be at the front line. And so what I'm saying is they're not quite so clever after all, are they? They might have known we were coming, but they weren't there waiting for us. And so despite this, they've all gone. Worse, the person they left in command of the front, while they all went off, General Stum, as soon as he was told of the attack, he wasn't feeling too well. Very pressurized day, high stress. I mean, Rommel has left you with the Africa Korps. You know the eyes of the world are upon you. Dies of a heart attack on the first day, leaving some real confusion as to who's going to be in command of the German army. So he's replaced eventually by von Thomas. Now, von Thomas, he's a good officer, but he's terrified about a lack of fuel. The German army is permanently short of fuel, and he says, well, wait a minute, what if we lose? We're going to need to be able to retreat. We're going to need fuel to get our vehicles back. And so one of his first orders are that the panzers are not to maneuver upon the battlefield, because it burns fuel they don't have. He says, I don't want to see those panzers maneuvering, at least for the next 24 hours, until we can confirm if another shipment of fuel has arrived, which gives the British tanks quite a nice little advantage, as strangely, these dashing panzer battalions aren't dashing quite as much as we would expect. But then again, before you say the Germans shouldn't have left him in charge, they hadn't, had they? They hadn't left this poor bloke in charge. He was just the last one left by the end of the first day. He probably didn't think he was going to be in this position either. Now, when the battle begins, the French fail to break through. The 7th Armoured are bogged down in the south. But in the north, the Australians had done rather well. So the south has gone almost nowhere. But our main attack was to be in the north, and there it's doing better. 10th Corps casualties have been absolutely appalling. It always will be when you feed men into this kind of attack, especially due to Stuka attacks. But Montgomery insists that the attack will continue regardless of loss. He knows that he's in this position because British generals have too often stopped attacks when there have been high losses. He is there only because he had said he wouldn't. And so, faced with high casualty reports, he simply says the attacks must continue. But as the New Zealanders are also bogged down, he decides to move the armour, moving it from the south up into the north to support the Australians, who have managed to inch their way forward to a place called Point 29. Now, General Tucker, very gifted general. However, he was the one who perhaps should have got the job instead of General Montgomery. And General Montgomery is aware that Tucker, one of his subordinates, rather fancied the job, had a good war record, and was on that front. And he was in command of 4th Indian Division. General Tucker was highly critical of the plan. Of course he would be, because he wants the bloke's job, doesn't he? But that doesn't mean that his criticisms are necessarily wrong. He said that what was particularly wrong with the first day was that the artillery wasn't concentrated properly. He said that if the north was to be the main attack, that's where the guns should have been concentrated. But of those 900 artillery pieces, only 200 were in the north. 700 were covering the centre and the diversionary attacks in the south. He had failed to concentrate adequate anti-aircraft and adequate artillery power in the north. What he was also critical of, I'm sure we've all heard of the German Flak 88, one of these wonder weapons, a high-velocity gun that can take out aircraft and knock out tanks from miles away. A beautiful bit of kit. And it is a beautiful bit of kit with lovely German-made optics so that you can really put a round straight into a British tank. What Tucker is still critical of is that the British had a very similar gun, the 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun. In actual fact, technically, the British version is better. It's got a slightly higher rate of fire. It's got a slightly higher muzzle velocity. So if you want to knock out tanks, it'll do a slightly better job. And we had hundreds of them. There were 400 of them along the Suez Canal alone to make sure the Germans didn't bomb that key route to our empire. But they never successfully bombed the Suez Canal. And Tucker said, even if we just took 200 of those 400 and used them at the front lines like the Germans did as an anti-tank weapon, then that could really make a difference. Or even if you're not going to do that, even if you're not going to give those 3.7-inch guns anti-tank rounds, and you're just going to keep them at the front, they'd have done horrible things to the German Stukas. These things are designed to hit Stukas down. 200 of them in the north, they'd have had a field day hitting those German Stukas, because most of our losses on the first day are inflicted by German Stukas. And there are hundreds of anti-aircraft guns just down the road guarding the Suez Canal. Those Australians would have loved to have seen these things light up the sky to protect them. But it's not done, despite the fact, and this is what makes it, I think, near criminal, despite the fact that only a few months before, when the House of Commons had asked, why don't the British have anything like the 88, the British government answered smugly, we do, we have the 3.7-inch and have already sent hundreds out to the desert. So it's not as if we didn't know it could be done. Our government had already boasted about how it could be done, and then we decided not to do it. The wonders of British planning in its way. And so Tucker was very critical of this. Now, as the attack grinds forward, that night Hitler tells Rommel that he has to return. He has to leave hospital, where he's ill, and return to Africa, arriving on the 25th. Now, he was told that all counterattacks on this front had failed, he was short of fuel, and he only had 31 fully operational tanks. There were a lot that could get repaired very quickly. There were a lot that kind of could be used if you started to cannibalize the parts. What didn't get included in those numbers were the Italian tanks, and the Italians weren't too pleased about that because they were fighting pretty well. But he said, right, you've got 31 fully operational German tanks. Now, Monty, meanwhile, had lost 300 tanks of his 1,200. So he's still got another 900 clanking along that front. Now, both sides then decided to commit fully to the northern battle around a place called Kidney Hill. The struggle of Kidney Hill will be critical. Monty throws in his tanks, the Indian troops, the South Africans, to fully support the Scottish and the Australians. On the night of the 26th, the Rifle Brigade advanced quite frankly by accident. They advance into an area that Rommel has decided to use as the concentration ground for the German tanks. So Rommel has said all the German and Italian tanks are to meet up here, ready for the counterattack. And by sheer bad luck, the Rifle Brigade have decided to advance right into that patch of desert. And they've started to dig in, waiting for further orders. They are about to have a really unpleasant day, because unbeknownst to them, every Axis tank on the front line has been told to go precisely where they are. But they start to dig in. As slowly, if we look at it slowly, the front grinds forwards towards that oxalic line, the little dotted line there. It really is a First World War style advance. The generals become happy when they start to advance 1,000 yards, but with lovely painting, by the way, of what the Rifle Brigade are about to have to do, the battle of Snipe, as they make their stand. And so, suddenly, on the night of the 26th, the Rifle Brigade are digging in. The sun comes up, and suddenly there are all these Axis tanks coming straight for the Rifle Brigade. But they do have a new anti-tank weapon, the 6-pounder. If only we'd had that, by the way, in 1939. It was already being tested in 1939. The 6-pounder was a lovely piece of kit. We sent out our army in 1939 to 1940 with a 2-pounder, which mechanically is brilliant. It's just not very good at destroying tanks. It's a wonderful piece of engineering. Its shell, though, is obsolete by 1940. We'd actually already designed the 6-pounder and we're working on trials of it. But we lost so much kit in 1940 that we decided we better just build what we could quickly and halt future development for a time because of immediate need. But now the 6-pounders are ready. And it's a lovely anti-tank gun. And the Rifle Brigade have them. However, the Rifle Brigade are cut off because there are initially tanks there to support the Rifle Brigade. But as these Axis tanks start to swarm towards them, the British armour is soon driven off. And so then the Rifle Brigade make their stand with their anti-tank guns, as the Axis armour is ordered to meet up in this field and then counter-attack from there. And so they keep on coming towards them. All day, they batter themselves against the Rifle Brigade. The Italian armour actually attempt to do their offensive by sweeping north in front of the Rifle Brigade. And that gives the Rifle Brigade an anti-tank gunner's dream, because right there in front of them, and their anti-tank guns, are the side armour of dozens of Italian tanks sweeping forward. The side armour of a tank is one of its thinner points. You'd rather hit the rear, obviously, but the armour's on the front, and the Italians move in front of the Rifle Brigade, trying to follow their orders. And the British gunners can't believe their luck. They open up with their brand new shiny anti-tank guns at these rather flimsy side armour of the Italian. It's a field of burning Italian tanks before someone tries to turn them round to try and kick the Rifle Brigade off. By the end of the day, there are only 13 anti-tank guns left working with the Rifle Brigade, and they're desperately short of ammunition. They think they're going to have to withdraw during the daylight, and that will be murder. Until a young lieutenant decides to take the risk, and he goes out into that field of burning vehicles, and he starts going towards the destroyed British anti-tank guns, the ones that have already been knocked out, starting to recover ammunition from the dead and the shattered gun positions and bring the shells back to try and keep the anti-tank guns in operation in what is a hugely heroic effort to resupply them. All day, they maul these Axis forces, until eventually at night, they're able to pull back and examine that field, leaving 63 Axis tanks knocked out in front of them. Now, some of those tanks were recoverable. Some of them could be turned for spares. Some 31 of them would be patched up, despite the fact they now have holes in them again. However, that is still a heroic stand at the Battle of Snipe, at the key moment of the battle, when every tank is worth its weight in gold, for 63 of them to be knocked out by these brave boys in this one rather obscure patch of desert. By the 25th, the Desert Air Force has managed to get almost total control of the skies. A great achievement. The Germans and the Italians, they can't keep these machines running. They keep on getting given new aircraft, but they're not given spare parts for it. And all the aircraft require different spares. And so they're having to junk what could have been perfectly serviceable aircraft. We now control the skies over El Alamein. And Monty prepares for another massive night assault, because of course it's at night, because we're British. And that's the only decent way to launch an attack. We'll do it at night, thank you very much. And so another massive night attack is planned, called Supercharge, to try and finally finish this battering war of attrition. It's going to be along a much shorter front, just 5 miles. We're no longer even going to try and advance along the 40-mile front. We'll advance along just 5 miles of that front and concentrate every gun we can in a whirlwind bombardment against the Axis lines. But while this is happening, the other side of Africa, towards Morocco and Algeria, there are 3 great sea armadas heading towards northwest Africa. Operation Torch, the planned landing by the British and the Americans in Algiers. As this fighting is going on, as the Battle of Snipe is raging, these armadas have already put to sea. And on the 1st of November, Supercharge begins with a 7-hour air assault against any Axis tank still moving. By the end of the day, there are just, even if you count the badly damaged ones, the ones that are having to limp along on one track, if they scrape everything together, the Axis can now put together 190 tanks along that front. They're going to be facing 800 British tanks. On the 2nd of November, at 1:05 in the morning, an ungodly hour, the attack begins. In a day, the Africa Korps is broken by the weight of the artillery fire and by waves of advancing veteran infantry. Rommel counterattacks the Australians in the north out of sheer desperation, while the British managed to smash their way through the centre of the Axis lines. In what's known as the Saucer Battle, the fighting is so fierce that there's a building in the middle of what they call a saucer. It's like a little depression where there's some buildings. There's a ruined building in the middle of that saucer. And both sides turn it into a medical unit. In just one room, you have both British and Australian medics working side by side, and both sides start to bring their wounded to the joint medical teams that have set themselves up in the middle of this battlefield, and both sides decide to leave that building alone to keep it as a hospital in the midst of the fighting, as German and Australian medics work on each other's wounded men in the same building. In what is, as we said, we always say the Desert War is more chivalrous than the Eastern Front. That's a very low bar. That's a very low bar. The Desert War often isn't chivalrous, but this is one of those rare moments that it is, with medical teams deciding that every life is precious, regardless of the uniform that they wear. And both sides, for once, respect that fact and leave those medics to do their jobs. Rommel then orders a withdrawal. His army has been broken. He will try and save what he can. He sends his own adjutant to Hitler, and he says, go to Hitler in Europe. Tell him Africa is lost. Because he's a man of drama, quite frankly. Africa is lost, he says. We have to just get out of Africa. A man called Lieutenant Berndt. Now, that is a really horrible job. No one wants to give Hitler bad news. As soon as he arrives, that lieutenant, who sends a lieutenant to do that? That's horrible. A lieutenant, he's in charge of, at best, 30. He's got 30 men, maybe 100 if he's in a bad place. But he goes and says, oh, Führer, Rommel says, Africa is lost. That's not what Hitler wants to hear. So he's sent straight away to a death battalion. The death battalions, they're men who are sent into no man's land to recover kit and told to bring it back. Or they're sent on death attacks. Some of them are sent through minefields to clear the minefields for their bodies, because you're going straight to a death battalion. Africa is not lost. The senior German general, General Wallemont, goes up to Hitler and goes, look, he's just telling you what Rommel has said. You can't blame him. And that's a huge mistake, because Hitler can blame who he likes, quite frankly. That's the thing about being Führer. There's no one to tell you you can't apportion blame. And so, as soon as General Wallemont starts to stand up for this lieutenant, he is sacked. But Rommel, back in the desert, he starts to pull back his troops. And in an attempt to get his troops out, he asks for the Stukas to attack the British front lines to give them a chance to pull away. As those Stukas sweep in towards the advancing British and Australian troops, they're intercepted by what we call hurry bombers, Hurricane that have been turned into bombing aircraft. As they desperately try and escape, they drop their bombs. But to heroic bad luck, those Stukas are right over the Africa Korps. And suddenly, German bombs are raining down right down onto German troops, as the Stukas try to save themselves and flee from the hurry bombers. Hitler tells the Africa Korps that they are to stand firm. You are to stand firm, and if necessary, stand and die. But the Italians are already off, because they're nobody's fools. And last time there was a retreat, they remembered that the Germans nicked all their trucks. And so they're not going to be caught this way again, thank you very much. And they're already trying to pull back. The German general von Thomas is captured next to a burning tank. And he stood next to this burning tank in his full dress uniform with all his medals on his chest. It was actually the first time in his career he'd worn his medals. He decided to get them put onto his uniform, especially to be captured, because if you're going to be captured, you're going to look good. And so he stood next to this burning German tank and is captured by the 4th Indian. Because the 4th Indian Division, under General Tucker, hasn't actually done any fighting. It's been kept in reserve. It's highly trained, highly motorized. It's one of our best divisions, and it's not been used. You might say, what a waste. Not a waste, because we knew at some stage the Axis were going to have to withdraw. And there's this highly trained, highly mobile force that is now released to try and chase the Africa Korps down so that they are destroyed at El Alamein. And so General Tucker's 4th Indian are the ones that find this German general in this rather pretty scene next to the burning tank. Now, in the air, the Germans are also struggling. Now, they'd introduced a new airborne radar set known as Liechtenstein, it was their first effective airborne radar to try and find the British aircraft that are bombing their cities at night. And it is paying off. Thanks to that airborne radar, that accounts for 349 of the 531 Allied bombers that are shot down over the summer. The only problem with Liechtenstein is it's about 2 years behind the British models. It's good, but the British wouldn't be using it anymore because it's obsolete. But to the Germans, this is cutting edge for their radar. So they're using it, and they're using it well. In October 1942, they introduced this, the Messerschmitt, the Bf-109G. And it is a real disappointment. On the plus side, it is faster than the F. However, it is prone to self-combusting. And I always find that an ominous phrase in any aircraft that I might be in, if I'm to be honest. But it is prone to self-combusting, has poor visibility, was very difficult to make, and was considerably less agile. But it is slightly faster. Now, truthfully, the 109 is now obsolete. It should have been scrapped. It's equivalent in many ways to the British Hurricane. It's a decent aircraft for its time, but it is no longer a frontline, or it shouldn't be a frontline fighter. And the British have already retired the Hurricane into a fighter-bomber kind of role, where it'll do bits and bobs, it'll do a bit of reconnaissance, it'll drop a few bombs, it'll machine gun some people, it'll do whatever. If you don't have many aircraft, it's a jack-of-all-trades thing now. But 109 really is starting to have to fit into that kind of category. The Germans would love to have replaced it, but they can't, because its replacement, the Focke-Wulf 190, is not yet ready for mass production. Now, to save time, Speer, their genius in charge of production, their head of armaments, he starts to scrap lots of future designs for aircraft. So they were meant to, as we were discussing last year, they were meant to replace the Messerschmitt 110 with the 210. But the 210 was a disaster. It kept on crashing and burning. And so he decides, we're not going to do that. We're just going to keep on using the 110. It was, by the way, the 110 was obsolete really in 1940. But now in 1943, they decide they're going to keep on making those, actually, because they just need aircraft. They need something that can fly. They're not going to work on the design of any four-engine bombers. So the Heinkel 177, he says, no, we can't spare the engineers. We can't spare the manufacturing capacity. So we're going to scrap that project. So when we think of British Second World War bombers, we think of the Lancaster, the Manchester, huge bombing aircraft. They decided that actually, no, they're going to carry on just making the 1934 vintage Heinkel 111s and Junker 88s. But they have a plan. They know that if the British learn that they've scrapped all future bomber design, the British will know how desperate the Germans are. So the Germans announce a brand new bomber entering service, the Junkers 188, because that must be new. It's actually just the Junker 88 with a new name. So that if the British learn about it, there are a few minor technical tweaks, much like the G to the F, but it's fundamentally the Junker 88 with a new name. But it's hoped that the British will panic and think there's a new bomber out there somewhere. However, thanks to all of this, German production does rise. Now, they made 870 aircraft in late 41. It rises to 1,341 aircraft per month in late 42. But the Axis aircraft, they're laughably obsolete now, really, compared to what can be produced in the West. Axis aircraft are falling further and further behind the British, the Americans, in terms of both quantity and in quality. Now, back to West Africa and Northwest Africa, and those three large armadas that are heading towards Africa. Here they come. 107,453 men are on their way, approaching the Vichy French colonies. They're commanded by Cunningham, the British commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, one of our greatest ever, I think, admirals. I mean, the man's a genius. The man who'd bombed the Italian fleet at the port Taranto, had evacuated Greece, had evacuated Crete, had won the Battle of Matapan against a superior Italian fleet. Now, one convoy had sailed actually directly from America, had sailed 3,000 miles. Two of them had sailed 1,000 miles. It includes 370 merchant ships and 300 warships. It's a huge demonstration of power. The largest sea invasion so far in history, as well as its largest armada. Of course, it'll be eclipsed next year for spoiler alerts, but nonetheless, at the moment, this is hugely impressive. It had been organised in just 2 months. You might say, why? We've been trying to negotiate with the French. We thought that Vichy France would join us because there's a lot of combat troops out there. There's a lot of troops, there's a lot of tanks, there's a lot of planes, all in the French armed forces. And we kind of hoped that we wouldn't have to shoot at them and that they might shoot at some Germans. And so we delayed and delayed, hoping that they would, in fact, join us. And so it's organised in the end by just 2 months. Now, there had been real problems and real fears. 8 merchant ships had been sunk only 100 miles away from one of these convoys. Before you go 100 miles away is a long way. It's not if I'm in a ship and there are some submarines out there. That's not far enough, quite frankly. And so 8 merchant ships have been sunk only 100 miles away from the convoys, leading to massive aerial attacks upon the U-boat bases. And on the 4th of November, there was a giant storm hitting the armadas. The Germans spotted the convoys, and they saw that they were coming. They think about where they're going, but they assume that the convoys are bound for Malta to help reinforce Malta. On the 1st of November, the General Vollemont, the one who will be sacked for trying to speak up for Rommel's adjutant, and one of their best strategic generals, by the way, the man is very gifted, just often overruled by Hitler. He is talking to Hitler about where they're going. Hitler goes, they are going to Malta. They're going, do you know what? I don't think they are, you know. I think they're going to land in Vichy French North Africa. He says, we're going to have to do something about this. They're going to open up a new front in northwest Africa. And he says, no, you don't understand strategy. They're not going there. There's not a chance. And he says, Hitler decides that if they're not going for Malta, they are either going for Crete, way in the east, Sicily, or Sardinia. And so the Führer orders German troops to be rushed to Crete to try and guard against the invasion. I mean, as if we'd try and risk floating so many men straight through the Mediterranean like that. It'd be heroic, but it'd be damnably dangerous. And what's on Crete? But thankfully, despite the fact that a German general knows where we're going, Hitler does not. And that's all that really matters. In the east, however, German losses have been staggering. Stalingrad and the Baku oil fields still have not been captured. Hitler decides that he must stop this convoy reaching Crete. Good news, it's not going to get there, but not in the way that he hopes. He decides he must stop it reaching Crete. So he orders the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, to destroy the convoy. It would never have been up to the job. He also sent ever more reinforcements to different islands across the Mediterranean to see where these are going. The landings begin at 4:30 in the morning on the 8th of November. The French General Gerard had insisted on being in command. Gerard said, if you're to send troops into the French Empire, a French general must be in command. Of the entire lot, utter madness, as if we would have given a French general a large British-American army, bearing in mind that France is officially at war with us. What did he think he was doing? But he insisted. We explained to him that his only job was to call on all the French troops to support the invasion. Annoyed, he refused to cooperate. He was there going, I'm not in command? No. She's not worthy of a man like me. As you can see, I watched too much of Low Low when I was a kid. Kept me entertained. Annoyed, he refused to cooperate until the landings were actually a success. The American forces are led by Patton. In some places, there's no resistance. In some places, the fighting is bitter. So we've got a picture here of American troops fighting French troops in Algiers. At one stage, British landings were met by advancing French tanks. The S-35s and British infantry were captured by French armoured units on some of the beaches and were then rescued when the French surrendered later in the day to other British troops that were advancing from other landing fields. By the way, an awful lot of French aircraft and tanks in 1940 were in North Africa. It's a shame they weren't in France for the 1940 campaign, quite frankly, because they had some really good armoured units out there. Or at least they were good armoured units for 1940. For 1943, those vehicles are showing their age a bit by now. But nonetheless, they've got some decent kit. And so there is in places some bitter fighting, especially at Algiers, and some fierce fighting against French tanks. However, there's soon a French coup, and the French generals are replaced by General Drouin. At Casablanca, the Vichy French battleship, the Jean Bart, one of the most modern battleships in the world. It's a brilliant battleship. It actually engaged in fire with an American battleship, the Missouri. And so the Jean Bart and the Missouri start to send shells whizzing towards each other. Both of them excellent modern battleships engaging in fire against each other. At Oran, the French fight bitterly against the British as they're inspired by memories of the British destroying their own fleet at Mers el-Kabir. They insist that they'll fight bitterly against the British. They say they'll only surrender if they see American troops. They're not going to, until they see American troops, they're going to keep on fighting, thank you very much. Because they know who the real enemy is, and it turns out that to the French, it's the British. The paratroop landings for this are an absolute disaster. The C-47 crew, although the paratroopers are an elite, the people bringing the paratroopers, those pilots, I'm afraid, they are not an elite. Because the ones that are given the job of flying the C-47s are the ones that qualified from flight school bottom of the class, which means that our most elite troops are being carried into battle by the least competent and least trained of the pilots. Of the 39 transport aircraft, 7 of them failed to find Algeria. Now that's quite the achievement, as it happens. On the 9th, General Clark, the American general, met the French leaders. It was clear Gérard was completely useless, and that the real key was the Admiral Darlan, the man who fought about joining our side in 1940, but then decided that we were going to lose and decided against it. He clearly was the power for the French in North Africa. But he's hesitant, as he wants to see what the Germans are going to do, and he also doesn't want the Germans to occupy the rest of Vichy France, which he knows is a real risk. And so he hesitates. It wasn't until the 10th, with US and British forces making rapid progress across Vichy French Empire, that he decides that he will order a ceasefire. He is then sacked by Vichy France. He had been supreme commander of all French forces in northern France, and he was northern Africa, and he was really proud of that. The next day, after he orders the ceasefire, he's sacked by Vichy France. What did he expect? Of course he's sacked. He's just told his entire army to surrender. But he's sacked, and this really hits his pride, so he tells the British and Americans that he's changed his mind, and could he please tell the French army to carry on fighting? In one of the most heroically idiotic requests. The British consider this, and they lock him up. They go, you're going to say what? Yeah, cool, just come this way. And so we lock him up so that he can't do. He is then replaced, and the new French general decides that he will fight on until the next day, because he wants to make sure that he's had a full day in command so that he can put it on his CV. Because somebody's going to be in charge of France after this war, and you want to say that you commanded a major conflict. And so on the 11th of November, the French fleet is told that if it doesn't surrender, the Americans are going to swamp North Africa with planes and tanks, and they're going to annihilate that force. And so they surrender. The entire landings have been a triumph of planning and logistics, and show that Britain and America really can work together in a way that has never been tried before by great powers. Before we go, but didn't we work together with the French and the Americans in the First World War? Not very well. I will point out to you in 1917, when we were fighting the Battle of Passchendaele, we only carry on fighting Passchendaele because we're told the French army have mutinied and can't fight. By the time that we're fighting at Passchendaele, that mutiny has already been over for a month. But the French know that if they tell us the mutiny is over, we'll stop the attack at Third Ypres, which will mean that British and German soldiers will stop killing each other, which will mean more work for the French soldiers. And so the French do the clever thing and go, no, sorry, got to carry on. Which, for France, is entirely the right decision. I don't blame them. If I was a French French politician, I'd have made the same choice. But what I'm saying is we didn't work together terribly well in the First World War. We really hoped that the fighting would be done by the other person. But in this campaign, America and Britain actually did work properly together, as allies should. Hitler is shocked because he was proven wrong, and that's not normal. And so he was shocked, and he orders the defense of Tunis. He says there must be a rapid build-up of arms. Now, von Ribbentrop, his foreign secretary, says, actually, mein Führer, maybe now is the time to discuss peace. He says, let's talk to Sweden, tell the Swedish government to contact the British and Americans. I don't think we can win. Why don't we discuss peace? But Hitler refuses. But he does recall the recently sacked Valemont, because he remembers that that bloke had been right. He's like, he was right. One good general, I sacked the wrong one. And so he brings him back. But he decides the French can't be trusted and would need to be occupied. Now, meanwhile, in Egypt, on the 6th of November, because that fighting, Montgomery had captured 20,000 men, 350 tanks, and 400 anti-aircraft and artillery pieces. There are thousands of precious trucks, and he manages to reach the city of Mersa Matrua before the bad weather calls to a halt to the chase. Critically, however, the Africa Korps escapes. For all their huge losses, they manage to escape. Firstly, they've got a head start. Secondly, they know that they're not going to get ambushed. The British know that the enemy might be around the next corner. We have to advance carefully. The Germans could just motor along the highway because they know there's no British troops between them and Libya. So they can really put their foot down. There is occasional fighting. The Italian 20th Corps, however, has been destroyed. The Trieste and Littorio divisions had fought, in fact, incredibly bravely, but their obsolete tanks were wiped out by the 4th Indian Division when the Littorio and Trieste divisions were told to be the rearguard. The Italian general fell back towards Serenissima, and then a lot of them are captured at Mersa el Brega. Now, on the 10th and the 11th, Hitler and Mussolini meet with Pierre Laval, head of the Vichy French government. Hitler has already planned to occupy Vichy France. He's going to invade and conquer southern France. And so he meets with the head of Vichy France, and he decides he's just not going to mention it. He goes, it would be rude for a start. And he certainly won't tell Mussolini that he's about to invade southern France, because that man's a blabbermouth and can't keep a secret. And so Hitler meets with Mussolini and Pierre Laval. Hitler refuses to accept that the war couldn't be won, and hopes that if he could reinforce Tunis enough, that will keep the Italians in the war. Now, Kesselring is sent, and he lands with a paratroop regiment, some 109s, some Stukas, while the French forces in Tunisia just watch, because the French in Tunisia don't know what to do. So there are French troops at Tunis airfield, and they watch as some German aircraft come and land. And they think, which side are we actually on now? Because the head of our government is having a face-to-face meeting with Hitler, so I think we're German. But Admiral Darlan has told us to surrender, but then we've not heard from him. Now, they could have just blasted those Germans as they landed on the airfield, but they decide not to, and they decide instead to just walk out of Tunis and head for the hills. And the Germans land, go, oh, look, there was a French army here. Where's it going? And they just watch as the French army just wander off into the hills to wait to find out what side they're on, quite frankly, and the Germans just watch them go. I think relieved that they weren't killed while they were in their air transports. And so they abandon Tunis. Within 2 weeks, 11,000 Axis troops had arrived, including motorized infantry, tanks. A new general was put in command, recently returned from injury on the Eastern Front. Actually, as he arrived in Tunis, his plane crashed, but he was all right. He managed to walk out of the wreckage. On the 24th of November, 10th Panzer arrive in Tunis with Tiger tanks. And unlike Rommel, Kesselring, who's put in charge of this, actually understands logistics and supply. And he gets on quite well with the Italians. Rommel famously gets on really badly with the Italians. Kesselring is sent, because at this stage in the war at least, he actually still gets on all right with the Italians. The French don't know what to do. And so they continue to fall back under the command of their general. Now, the Allied response was to try and negotiate with the French and say, look, you've got an army on the ground. Could you stop this? And so we tried to negotiate with Admiral Darlan. The problem is Admiral Darlan absolutely hates the British. If there are two things that Admiral Darlan hates, it's the British and it's Jews. And that leads to real questions of which side does he really think he's on. Because he's there going, well, yeah, obviously, now that you've captured me, I'd quite like France to win the war. But if France could win the war and Britain could lose it and all the Jews could die, could you arrange that? We're like, we can't arrange that. I have no idea what you think this world has become, but that can't be arranged right now. That is not an outcome that is likely in any world. And so we try and negotiate with Darlan to get that French army to resist the German build-up. Now, Cunningham had wanted to land the British and Americans closer to Tunis, because he knew that Tunis would be key, but he'd been told that it was too big a risk. And the problem with the Tunis build-up is that Italy is actually closer to Tunisia than our landings are. Italy is only around 560 miles away, whereas our landings at Casablanca are 1,500 miles away. And so despite Cunningham wanting to land closer, he's not been allowed. And so the campaign will be put under the command of General Anderson and the British First Army, because the French can't be trusted to do this job. So General Anderson and the First Army are going to be told to take Tunis. Air power is going to be key. Gibraltar is already like an unsinkable aircraft carrier. By the way, the man who turned Gibraltar into a giant airbase was Lord Gort, the man who commanded the BEF in France in 1940. He got sacked as a British frontline general after he managed to get our troops out of France in 1940. I think he actually did quite well. He got sent to Gibraltar as a punishment. The first thing he did was, look, if we're to win this war, this is going to have to be a giant airbase. And he made that decision in 1940. In 1940. And yet a lot of people say that man's an idiot. And so thanks to his far-sighted work, there are hundreds of aircraft in Gibraltar to try and support this. But we need to get air bases closer to Tunis. And slowly, one by one, the British and Americans start to capture these air bases. So Su El Arba on the 16th, Yuz El Brin falls to the Americans on the 17th. That day, for the first time, by the way, on the 17th of November, French and German troops fight each other for the first time since 1940, when General Barras finally decides to stop falling back out of Tunis and try and go back into Tunis. And he discovers the Germans just won't let him in. And so the two sides start to clash. And also at that stage, the British destroy a German armoured reconnaissance force. By the 21st of November, the Allies are actually within 25 miles of Tunis. But huge numbers of German aircraft arrive. The Germans strip the Eastern Front of aircraft, and they send them to the Tunis campaign. Because to Hitler, this is now the most important battle, because Stalingrad's practically captured already, isn't it? And so huge numbers of German aircraft arrive in Tunis in November to try and blast the Allies away. And so the terrain is very hilly. Don't think desert sand, think hills, think Cork woods. And so there is a huge build-up of force. And at sea, the U-boats are still threatening. The British, however, were starting to hunt these U-boats with new high-tech designs and aircraft. So the British introduced aircraft that have got armor-piercing rockets that can burst the U-boat hulls. The Americans actually have air-launched home-in torpedoes that can home in on the U-boats. They also have disposable airdrop sonar locators. So American aircraft can airdrop these sonar locators, just drop them into the sea. The Americans are making so much that they don't need to worry about recovering it, find where the submarine is, and then launch some airborne home-in torpedoes to hunt down these U-boats. It's becoming increasingly dangerous for the U-boat. The British introduced the Hedgehog anti-submarine warfare system. It's got like a collection of spines, and it launches 24 little bomblets, each 1.5 kilograms in weight, guided by ASTIC, what we call sonar, ASTIC, into the sea to try and hunt out these U-boats. Even so, despite this, 128 Allied merchant ships are sunk in November, 117 of those by U-boats. This is going to really slow our build-up for the fight for Tunis. However, an American shipyard is capable of building a new ship every 5 days. Every 5 days. How long has it taken us to not get HS2 to Manchester? How long would it take us to build a new merchant ship these days? And so even though in a month over 800,000 tons of Allied shipping have been lost, we've built nearly the same amount. And also, despite this huge number of ships being sunk by U-boats, 117 in a month, only 39 of those were sunk in the Atlantic. Most of those sinkings are along the American coast, where the Americans are still refusing to introduce the convoy system. And so the spike in sinkings were also because the U-boats have a new kind of electronic system, which they call METOX. It's a system that can pick up some Allied radar and sonar emissions, so that the submarine knows that it's being hunted. But it can't pick it up all. Strangely, it can only pick up those that are being used by the Canadians. And before we go, what, does it really hate the Canadian accent? No, the Canadians have all the old kit the British have got rid of. When the British make new ASTIC kits, they give their old kit to the Canadians, and METOX can pick up the old kit's signals. Unfortunately, the Canadians do over a third of all the convoy escort duty. And so a third of all convoy escorts, the German U-boats can now pick up in advance. And so what we've got here is an electronic battle for control of the seas, while both sides are trying to flood Tunis with supplies. Also, we can't put as many aircraft over the Bay of Biscay as we'd like, because the Germans have turned the Junker 88 bomber into a fighter, the Junker 88E. You might say it's a stupid idea, because it's got a long range, and their fighter bomber type thing can shoot down our long range bombers, because it's slightly more maneuverable. And so our aircraft are having to be withdrawn from the Bay of Biscay. Now, finally, however, with Torch succeeding, more and more escorts can actually be released back to escort duty, because those escorts have been stripped from merchant guarding to guard the landings, because we couldn't afford for those men to die. But that meant that our hunting of the submarines had halted while we guarded Torch, and these ships start to get sent back. Despite the losses, by the way, 80% of our merchantmen are still getting through. But clearly, although Percy Noble has done great work with the escorts, it's time for a change. And so he's replaced by Sir Max Horton, who's told to get a grip of the Battle of the Atlantic and the U-boat fight. At this stage, by the way, there are 90 U-boats in the Atlantic. 90. And remember that they started the war with 8. To give you some idea that they've finally taken the U-boat. If they'd done that, by the way, in 1940, they could have won the war. If they'd have had 90 U-boats in 1940, can't really see how we could have survived. Thankfully, they didn't. And so they've got these numbers of U-boats too late. Now, on the Eastern Front in the Caucasus, before we go and get ourselves a drink, don't worry, I'm aware of the bar calling. On the Eastern Front in the Caucasus, the German forces get to within 1 mile of the Georgian military road, which leads to the oil fields. They can see the road that leads to those oil fields they need to capture, which, as I said a year ago, had they captured, they wouldn't have been able to move the oil back to Germany anyway, because, of course, the roads and the pipes don't connect. But it doesn't matter. They're within 1 mile of the Baku oil fields that supply the Russian war effort, the gateway to oil. But they're pushed back by the Red Army. And on the 19th of November, to the German surprise, the Soviets counterattack around Stalingrad. Operation Uranus has begun. The Germans didn't know it was coming. How could they? Almost all their aircraft are over Tunis. The Germans don't know it's coming. In just 4 days, the Romanian Third Army in the north and the Fourth Army in the south are swept aside, and the German Sixth Army is encircled at Stalingrad. So here we have Romanian soldiers guarding the flanks of the mighty German Sixth Army. Those poor boys, mostly equipped with French equipment, by the way. When they'd initially trained, they'd assumed they'd be fighting Germany in alliance with France. And had we just agreed to pay more for their wheat, probably would have done. However, here they were, guarding the German army, and they were just annihilated by the Russians, and the Germans are trapped in the city of Stalingrad. 275,000 Germans stuck in that city. 100 tanks, 2,000 pieces of German artillery, 10,000 trucks. By the 24th, the Romanian Fourth Army has ceased to exist. The Third Army has been pushed back 50 miles to the Chir River. Army Group A the one that's pushing for the oil fields, is now in real danger of being trapped in the Caucasus and is forced to flee from the oil fields to try and escape. Manstein is put in charge of the front, and he begs the 6th Army to try and break out. He says to von Paulus, the commander in Stalingrad, look, you've got 275,000 men, a highly mechanized army. For God's sake, just break out of the encirclement. Counterattack. Try and drive into that Russian army. But von Paulus refuses because Hitler has given him personal orders not to leave Stalingrad. And so he refuses Manstein's orders. Instead, Goering says he will supply the city by air. It needs 750 tons of supplies a day to keep that army going. Goering reckons he can give them 500, so he says they'll just have to go hungry for a bit. Turns out that even if the Russians let him, even if the Russians just let these aircraft come over, at best he could manage 350. And these boys need 750 tons a day. They only have 298 aircraft across this part of the Eastern Front, because they stripped them, of course, to send them to Tunisia. And that's often forgotten. If you wonder where the Luftwaffe went, Tunisia is where it's gone, not over Stalingrad. And there, with the German army stuck in Stalingrad, and the German Air Force in Tunis, and the French finally starting to fight the Germans again, and with the British having won at Alamein, I think it is time for a drink. Thank you very much. It's nice to see that you've returned, actually, I have to say. It's always a bit of a worry for the longer lectures that might be doing the second half with just myself. But let's carry on the story, because in Egypt, German forces continue to retreat, abandoning equipment along the way. By heroic efforts, they're kept supplied, and they even capture the odd over-ambitious British reconnaissance force chasing them. In fact, the German general in charge of the retreat, the General von Luck, even had a radio conversation with an officer of the Royal Dragoons, because the Royal Dragoons had lost one of their reconnaissance forces, and so just try to try their luck, they tried to radio the German forces to see if their mates were okay. And von Luck insisted on talking to the officer himself, and he assured them that he'd captured that entire reconnaissance force, and he even told the Royal Dragoons which ones they'd captured alive, so they could pass the news back to their families so that they wouldn't worry, and promised them that he'd look after them, which is very wise, because if I was in charge of a retreating army thinking that I might be captured at any time, I also would start stressing the importance of treating people well, letting the family know, and not killing prisoners. And so, a lot of people look at that and go, oh, how nice. Whereas I've always read that and go, how self-serving, even though it is nice. But it happened. On the 13th of November, the British retake Tobruk. But the pursuit is not as active as it should have been. The Desert Air Force had wanted to annihilate the Africa Korps east of the Hellfire Pass, but they can't. They're hampered by a slow delivery of supplies, particularly fuel, by the 8th Army. The 8th Army refuses to prioritize the delivery of fuel supplies to the Air Force, and so often aircraft are left without fuel for their engines and can't do the damage they'd wish to. By the 4th of November, Monty actually halts the chase. He doesn't want to risk even a small reverse. So he tells Tucker, after just 3 days of chasing the Africa Korps, to stop, to halt chasing the Africa Korps, in case the Africa turn around and inflict a stopping blow on the 4th Indian. Because he knows that his position is still weak. He's a political general, and he knows that if there's even a slight reverse, he might lose his job, and he's not going to risk even that slight risk. But it's a shame, because the Axis are on the ropes. The Luftwaffe had to destroy 63 aircraft on the ground to stop them being captured. 21 Panzer only has 11 tanks left. 15th Panzer has not a single tank left as they try and escape towards the coast. The 4th Indian Motorized is fresh, and it is elite, but it only has those 3 days to chase the Axis. In the end, the Desert Air Force is so desperate for fuel, they actually talk to the Americans, and they ask the Americans to fly fuel to them. And the US Air Force fly 48,510 gallons of fuel to the Desert Air Force so that they can keep their aircraft flying, because the 8th Army is still not prioritizing the delivery of fuel to the Desert Air Force. Whereas over in the West, the 1st Army's advance continues on Tunis with a mixture of British, French and American troops supported by the American Air Force. Now, the American Air Force is keen, but it doesn't know what it's doing. It has no doctrine for close air support. In the last days of November, British infantry try to press on into Tunis, supported by American artillery, but they're halted by the Luftwaffe. And on the 30th of November, further attacks are cancelled. There are huge deliveries of 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s into Tunis, with veteran pilots from the Eastern Front and the skies over Malta, and they do horrible damage to the inexperienced American Air Force. On the 3rd of December, the Germans attack along the Mujada Valley against the Americans opposing them before Tunis. The American tanks lack artillery support, and they're soon shot up by German anti-tank units. The British commander advises the Americans to fall back in front of the advancing Germans and to retreat to a place called Long Stop Hill. However, the Germans soon storm Long Stop Hill, making short work of the light American Stuart tanks. For the Allies to take Tunis, they're going to first of all have to clear the Mujada Valley. To clear the Mujada Valley, they have to take Long Stop Hill. And so you must take the hill, take the valley, take Tunis. That is to be the plan. But it will all start with Long Stop Hill. The front is then frozen for weeks by heavy rain. But on the 19th of December, the weather clears, allowing 20,000 British, 11,000 American, and 39,000 French troops, so it's a mostly French army, to try and advance against what are now 40,000 well-equipped Germans, commanded by von Arnim, who has been withdrawn from the Eastern Front. Despite the dangers on the Eastern Front, he has been withdrawn to command the defences at Tunis. The Coldstream Guards are the ones that attack on Long Stop Hill on Christmas Eve, and they take it. But by Christmas Day, they've lost it again, as the Germans counterattack at Long Stop Hill. And the bad weather returns, and the ground returns to mud. At this stage, however, in Algiers, a member of the Free French Resistance assassinates Admiral Darlan, to the huge relief of the British, because they couldn't kill him themselves, because he's on our side, but now we don't have to work with him. And it's made relations with the French a lot simpler now that he's been killed. We obviously tell the Free French off and go, look, you really can't go around shooting your own side, while we don't go into really great detail about who actually did the shooting. Possibly we encourage them. But nonetheless, back on the Eastern Front, Manstein counterattacks right into this Russian offensive, launching his attack on the 18th of December. Manstein's counterattack gets to within 16 miles of Stalingrad. There across the flatlands, you can see the ruins of Stalingrad in the distance. And he gets on the radio and he insists on talking to von Paulus, who's in command of over 250,000 elite German troops in Stalingrad. And he begs him, he says, please, break out. It's just 16 miles. Break out of Stalingrad. He says, I need your men. To be able to get to within 16 miles of Stalingrad, I've once again stripped the Eastern Front to be able to drive for Stalingrad. To try and guard my flanks, there are Hungarians, there are Italians, there are Czechs, there are Croats, there's all sorts to guard our flanks. But we've reached 16 miles of Stalingrad, come out, and then we can try and stabilize the line. But von Paulus refuses, because Hitler has refused him permission. He has told him that Stalingrad is a fortress, and Sixth Army must stand and fight. Now, back in Germany, Admiral Raeder, head of the German fleet, is sacked for failing to stop the convoys, and is replaced by Dönitz. Hitler says we're going to scrap the surface fleet. All those lovely battleships, battlecruisers, cruisers, we're going to melt them down for scrap metal because Germany is short of metal. But Dönitz, despite the fact he's a submarine commander, says, no, don't, because if the British learn about it, that's going to be a huge lift of Allied morale. And do we really need the metal that badly to go scrapping good combat units? He said that'd be a huge psychological boost to the Allies. Don't do it. But the Allies meet at Casablanca. And here are our Allies meeting at Casablanca. They're there to discuss how to win this war. Now, previously, just the day before, 7 fuel tankers carrying 100,000 tons of fuel for the British and Americans in North Africa had been sunk. That's the background. British shipping is creaking. There's the Mediterranean still closed, which means that all our trade with India and Australia is going around South Africa, the slow route. There's huge demands for shipping from the Far East, from Egypt, from North Africa, supplying British factories, feeding Britain, building up air power in Britain. We just don't have enough merchantmen. The cross-channel invasion plans the Americans have, because the Americans really want to invade France in 1943. We don't, they do. Those plans have to be scrapped. We don't have the ships. Our ships are busy. And so instead, because they say, well, we have to land somewhere, we go, okay, you can start to plan for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. And so the plans for 43 are, we will win in Africa, we will invade Sicily, the British will attack in Burma, and the Americans will attack the Japanese in the Solomon Islands. The Americans also state that they will only accept unconditional surrender. They will not allow Germany a negotiated peace, which does mean the war will go now to the bitter end. Throughout 1942, the U-boats had sunk 7,800,000 tons of shipping, but the Allies had built 7 million tons of shipping, but every single Allied plan needed huge numbers of merchant ships. Now, we have wisely decided that the way we are going to fight is with machines, not men. But that does mean you need a lot of supplies. The British Admiral, Admiral Pound, says that the war against the U-boats is the most critical theatre of the entire war. The Americans and the British are trying to fight a manpower-efficient war. We could have put a much larger army into the field. There is no doubt we could have put an extra couple of million men into the front lines, but we weren't going to. We had planned what we call a robot army. That was the language of the 1930s. They said that large armies are inefficient, it leads to large loss of life. We want machines, not men. We want our men to have excellent medical care, to have lots of equipment, good rations, plentiful ammunition, but all of this takes shipping. So we're going to put our young men onto merchant ships rather than into trenches. That will be, we think, the best way and the most efficient way of winning the war. It is the right choice. It is absolutely the right choice, but it does mean you need ships. And we say the situation is desperate. Supplies are running low. But when we say that supplies are running low, Britain has in Britain 5,300,000 tons of fuel oil saved. That's a huge stockpile to save for a rainy day. To put it into perspective, that is more than Germany uses for its entire war effort in a year. That is our rainy day. I wish I had that kind of rainy day funded for my bank account, quite frankly. That's a huge stockpile to have. So when we say things are desperate, the Germans would argue otherwise. But we say that we're going to have to crush the U-boats, and for that we want very long-range aircraft, so our aircraft can escort the merchantmen to move these supplies and this equipment around. Now, in North Africa, American troops, they're very enthusiastic, but they're inexperienced. But they're learning quickly. Put it in perspective, in 1941, the American army still had horses, and they were a border defense force to try and protect against the Mexicans. They are learning fast against veteran German troops. However, we can all see that the French troops, they're not keen, they're badly equipped. The American troops, keen, well-equipped, badly trained. And so the British are going to have to do a lot of the work. Now, sorry, I do apologise. I've realised I've been messing around with my own supply. And so, this situation, the fighting must be done in Tunisia by the British. Now, the French have been trying to stay out of the conflict. However, we tell them that the time has come that they really must start to make up their mind. Now, the Rommel on the Germans have decided that actually the war in Tunisia cannot be won. He says you can't win in Africa. You might hold for a time, but that's all you're going to achieve. And so Rommel recommends to Hitler the evacuation of North Africa. And so Rommel is told that he is going to be sacked. Hitler will not have any general that will talk about defeat. And so Rommel is retreating through Libya, and he abandons El Algira before the British can even reach it. And they keep on retreating. But von Arnim now has 65,000 German troops in Tunisia, as Rommel falls back with another 80,000. So that's 145,000 Germans in North Africa falling back on Tunis. It is, however, opposed by only 38,000 British, French, and American troops in First Army and the 8th Army. You must stop Rommel and von Arnim linking up. And so the inexperienced American general, Eisenhower, he's excellent, but he's never actually commanded in combat at this stage. His suggestion is to drop some British and American troops between the Africa Korps and the German troops building up in Tunis. Thankfully, the British talk him out of it. Whatever we dropped into there would have simply been annihilated by the fast-fleeing Africa Korps. Caught between von Arnim and Rommel, whatever force we put there would have been destroyed. But even so, that means there's going to be nothing to stop the Africa Korps linking up with von Arnim. Now, Eisenhower hoped to win the campaign by mid-May. However, this is clearly not going to happen. And so Eisenhower offers to resign. He says, I've botched this badly. I'm going to stand aside. But the British got on really well with Eisenhower and persuaded him not to resign. And they said, actually, instead of resigning, we would like you to be promoted. We're going to promote you up because we think you can get the British, Americans, and French working together well. And it is clear that if there's one skill the British don't have, is to get the British and French working together well. And so they say, look, your combat command, no offence, subpar. However, the way you spoke to those French people and didn't get shot, could you please be in overall command and we will find somebody to do the actual command on the battlefield. And we send General Alexander, one of our best generals of the Second World War. So General Alexander will be actually put in command of the troops. He's experienced, he's confident, and so he is put in command of both the First Army and the 8th Army, which we now label the 18th Army, because it's the First Army and the 8th. So it's the 18th Army Group. Tedder is put in charge of the Air Force, and Cunningham is put in charge of the fleet. The other Cunningham of the Air Force, the Desert Air Force, is put in charge of air support for the Tunisia campaign. On the 23rd, Tripoli in Libya falls. The British had blasted through the Tripoli defences by the 14th, leaving just the Homs line. But the 8th Army rapidly outflanked it, so again Rommel, falling back quickly through Libya, manages to escape without a fight. Mussolini was furious, by the way. Tripoli is the capital of Libya. Mussolini ordered Rommel to stand and fight for Tripoli. He said, you can't fall back. You must stand. When that message arrived at Rommel's headquarters, his officers gasped in shock and horror. And this is what Rommel said to Mussolini. You can either hold Tripoli for a few more days and lose the army, or lose Tripoli a few days earlier and save the army for Tunisia. Please make up your mind. However, he didn't wait to hear the answer. He kept on scuttling out of Libya. He'd made up his mind. And so Tripoli is abandoned and it falls on the 23rd. And the British start to approach this, the Maref line. That is on the border of Tunisia and Libya. Built by the French in the 1930s to protect Tunisia from the Italians in Libya. They called it the African Maginot Line. And so the British are going to have to try and blast their way through these defences to try and reach Tunisia and link up with the British First Army. On the 26th of January, Rommel was relieved of command for his words that Africa couldn't be held. And he's replaced by an Italian general called Messe. But he says, look, before I go, can I launch one last attack? And Hitler's like, attack? Hey? Yes! Launch the attack, but then you're sacked. And so he launches his last attack. And his plan, because he knows that Monty is not the hurrying type. So he knows that Monty will not attack that Maref line quickly. So he decides to strip the Maref line of every man he can to hurl against the British First Army in the hope that he can beat the British First Army to swing round and fight the British Eighth Army along the Baref line. It is a huge gamble, it's hugely ambitious, in many ways insane, but he gives it a go. And so back in Germany, however, on the 30th, it's the 10th anniversary of Hitler's accession. And Goering is given the job of doing the radio talk to say how happy Germany is for these 10 years. But the British know that this is going to happen. And so we send a couple of Mosquito bombers to try and attack the radio station, just so that that radio broadcast has to be delayed 3 hours. And so the grand speech to say how happy Germany is, delayed by 3 hours while the British try and bomb some radio station, really just to ruin the speech. However, the speech is all about how the heroes of Stalingrad will hold and defeat the Russians in the east. Now, on the 2nd of February, Sixth Army and General Paulus surrender. And so this is Germany's Sixth Army being taken away into captivity. The Germans were, and by the way, they were kept by the Russians. Many were killed in captivity, and many were kept for decades in what must be considered a war crime. But the Russians do not treat prisoners well. And so they surrender. On the radio, the Germans were told that the Sixth Army had been like the Spartans at Thermopylae, dying so that Germany could win the war. The Sixth Army had been Germany's largest. 110,000 Germans had died. Most now knew the war could not be won. Food was again scarce. Hitler announced, however, that they were now going to fight total war. He called up an extra 500,000 men of the age of 17. Previously, Germany had only called up 18-year-olds and above. He called up 500,000 17-year-old boys to put into the army, to turn this war around. All women between the age of 17 and 45 would now have to do war work. Any business not helping the war effort would have to close. Tank production would be prioritised. Tank workers would have to work a 72-hour week. They'd be given extra rations if they worked in tank factories. Tank production would also be prioritised for steel. Guderian was recalled as Inspector General of the Armoured Troops. Even so, in the whole war, Germany would make 5,976 Panthers and 1,354 Tiger tanks. So about 6,000 Panthers, about 1,400 Tiger tanks in the whole war. To put that into perspective, Russia was making 1,200 T-34s a month. That should give you some idea of the sheer numbers of equipment that the Germans were going to have to fight, even with this effort. And so the Germans had already lost huge numbers of tanks, mostly due to a shortage of fuel. Increased production wasn't going to change that. The production of Panthers and Tigers in particular were prioritised, but even so, Germany was now making 17 different types of tank gun. 17. That's a huge waste of spares, of ammunition, different calibers. A lot of these tank guns were junk that should have been abandoned years ago, but they're still producing it because they just need numbers. And so when we think that the German army is full of this great kit, a lot of it's not worth the paper that you've written the production order on. There is some great bits of kit, but some of it is absolute junk. And the problem with things like the Panther and the Tiger is they use a lot of fuel. Germany have 21 synthetic fuel plants. They have to turn coal into liquid fuel. It's hugely inefficient, and it's very difficult. Germany was also at this time trying to build the Atlantic Wall to keep us out of Europe, the largest work of fortifications since the Great Wall of China. But they especially decided to prioritise the Channel Islands in case Britain really wanted Jersey back. I holiday in Jersey. It's lovely. It's not a strategic target. The Channel Islands, however, consumed 12% of all of the available resources for the Atlantic Wall. 260,000 labourers worked on the Channel Islands. They built 15,000 bunkers. Just think what that could have done on any other part of the front. A huge waste of effort. On the 18th of February, Army Group A finally crosses the Kerch Straits into the Crimea out of the Caucasus. Sadly, because we start to learn these place names all too well from our news now, where Russia and Ukraine are fighting. Rostov and Kharkov had been retaken by the USSR. Back in Africa, however, the route to Tunis is controlled by 4 passes through the mountains. On the 18th of January, the Axis control all 4. as they drive the Allies out of them. Now, in places, British artillery managed to halt the attacks by Rommel, but the Americans and the French, they can't stop the German army, particularly when they're led by tigers. The Germans capture 3,500 French troops who only a few weeks ago had been on their side. And so they've had a complex war. And US troops are rushed to try and help the French. It is clear that the French need to be taken out of the line, retrained, re-equipped. But of course we can't spare them because they're the bulk of the First Army. And so they must remain. And so Anderson now decides that actually also the American kit isn't good enough. And so Anderson orders that French and American formations are to be equipped, where possible, by British equipment, especially the British 6-pounder anti-tank gun. The SAS have also been expanded and the special boat service have been created. The SAS now include a French and a Greek detachment too. But David Stirling has been captured while trying to get through to the British First Army. 21st Panzer is soon rushed to the Fayed Pass, capturing 1,000 American soldiers. 75% of all Axis supplies to Tunis are getting through. It's not being sunk. And so 40 to 50,000 tons a day are arriving at Tunis. To put that into perspective, remember, they couldn't get 500 tons a day to Stalingrad. They're getting 40 to 50,000 a day to Tunis. It's a big campaign. It's important for the outcome of the war. They have there now 105,000 men, 200 tanks, including 11 Tigers. But Rommel and von Arnim both hate each other. They won't work well together. They both want to be the big boss of Africa. Even so, they both agree that they're going to attack the US Second Corps, called Operation Springwind. Now, Rommel and Varlamont, however, still think that really Africa should be evacuated, but Hitler disagrees. Now, the US general, so there's General Anderson, the British general, there's the US general, General Fredenhall. He is insane. He is completely unhinged. He has broken his units up into tiny little formations because he argues that if you lose a formation, you might as well lose a small one. Which I can see the logic of, but that's not the thought. And he's begun work on a huge underground bunker complex because he thinks the main priority of the German armies in Africa are him. And so he needs an underground bunker to keep him safe. Now, we think of the Second World War as quite a mobile war. Underground bunkers for headquarters is not really the way to go. But he starts construction work. 10th Panzer sweep through the American Second Corps, through the Fayed Pass, pushing aside French and American troops. Anderson, however, thinks this is not the German main attack, because Anderson has ultra decrypts saying the German main attack will be in the north. What he doesn't realise is the Germans have changed their mind, and that this is the main German attack. Even so, he sends small numbers of British tanks to try and help the Americans and French, but they're soon brushed aside. On the 15th of February, a British-American counterattack is slaughtered by panzers and anti-tank guns, with 98 tanks, 57 half-tracks, 29 guns, and 500 men lost, almost all American. And Anderson begins to fall back towards the mountain line of the Grand Dorsal. Now, Rommel had planned only a limited offensive, and he's achieved all he set out to achieve. But Rommel sticks to type. He achieves what he wants to achieve, and then he thinks, wait a minute, I could now achieve more. And he's starting to dream of conquering all of North Africa. And he thinks he can now break through. And so he thinks he needs to push through for a major victory and a drive on the Kasserine Pass. On the 17th of February, the Americans fall back through Kasserine. On the 18th, Rommel takes the airfields. 34 fighters are destroyed upon the ground. On the 18th and 19th, von Locke tries to storm the Kasserine Pass with a surprise assault, but fails. Now, Rommel's advance starts to run out of steam. To his disgust, von Arnim, instead of pushing west, ever west, decides to push north to attack the British formations. And Rommel is starting to run out of fuel once again. Rommel, throughout the war, becomes convinced that with just a bit more fuel, or with just a few more tanks, he could win a major victory. They were close, after all, to the main American supply base at Tabasa. And he felt that if he could just capture that, then maybe they could push on to the Atlantic once again. But they're coming across a brand new British weapon, the 17-pounder anti-tank gun. This thing is absolutely lethal. High velocity, better than the German 88. It can knock out a Tiger, a great rate of fire. By the 22nd, he is halted by these new British anti-tank guns and is forced to withdraw. Even so, overall, Allied losses have been horrible. The Americans have lost 6,000 dead and 3,000 taken prisoner. But German losses are similar at Kasserine, and they're harder to replace than Americans, and Rommel is increasingly ill. On the 17th of February, General Alexander finally arrives and takes command. He's highly experienced, he's very confident. The Americans take to him instantly. He turns to the Americans, because the Americans turn to him and say, "I'm really sorry, we've given you an army in full retreat." And he laughs and goes, "Actually, in my entire career, I've only ever taken control of armies in retreat. It's okay." And in fairness, he's right. That is his entire career. And so he starts to get the Americans to be re-equipped and to be retrained with British equipment. He halts the retreat, and he gives them a bit more fighting spirit. And then he orders the 8th Army to break through the Maref line that they've been sitting in front of. So we have here, this is a British Valentine heavy tank in Tunisia, as we start to push at that Maref line to link up to the 1st Army. On the 26th of February, von Arnim launches a three-pronged attack in the north, but without telling Rommel that he's going to be attacking. He's held up by British troops and their 17-pounders at Hunter's Gap all day. And these British troops here managed to maul 3 entire German panzer battalions. On the 28th, the Germans attack again, led by Tiger tanks towards Beja. In a 10-day battle, British dug-in infantry, supported by anti-tank guns, drive off wave after wave of German tanks, showing that British infantry dug in with anti-tank guns simply won't be shifted by the panzers. Their losses are horrible. Elsewhere in Norway, just as a bit of an aside, Norwegian saboteurs blow up the Vernuk heavy water plant, critical to the German atomic weapons program. Because of that, the Germans panic and assume that Norway is full of British saboteurs and send another 3,000 men to guard against further attacks. So even as their armies are being annihilated at Stalingrad and they're fighting at Tunis, and even though they're reinforcing Crete, they decide they now need to reinforce Norway as well. How far to spread can these 17-year-olds be put? At the same time, the Canadian escorts are re-equipped with modern British equipment to allow them to hunt out the submarines. And Houghton creates 5 hunter groups to try and hunt out these submarines throughout the Atlantic. There's a giant convoy battle, however, involving 40 U-boats attacking convoy HX229, SC122, and 633,000 tons of British merchantmen are sunk in a month. And so the fighting is really heating up. On the Eastern Front, again and again, the Russians manage to encircle new groups of German troops. But again and again, the German troops break out, like those at Stalingrad should have done. And so they fail to destroy the German army on the Eastern Front. I have here the words of a Waffen-SS captain, Karl Gadur. The Russians weren't very good. They had mass, that's all. They had good generals and artillery, but their soldiers were poor stuff. As German units are again and again encircled, only to break out of the trap. The Soviets mass a large number of light tanks, and they hope to be able to encircle most of the German southern front by racing light tanks towards the sea and cutting them off, more or less actually where the Ukrainian and Russian army are currently fighting. And so they drive through the German lines, having broken through, and they hope to trap all of Army Group A. However, Manstein rallies the German forces, counterattacks with the panzers, and manages to just annihilate and destroy this Russian light tank force, encircling the force that was meant to be encircling the Germans, and wiping it out. And Manstein now starts to counterattack. On the 11th of March, he retakes Kharkov. On the 18th, he retakes Belgorod. Think what he could have done, by the way, with that extra 250,000 men with their heavy equipment that he should have had, as he drives the Russians back and back and back. In the north, near Moscow, Hitler finally agrees to abandon the Rezes salient, which is just before Moscow. The Germans can still see Moscow, but they're not going to be able to get there. And so Hitler is finally persuaded to abandon that, which shortens the front line by 250 miles to give more men to Manstein for his amazing counterattack. And by the way, if Sixth Army had broken out, then maybe Germany could have got the Russians to negotiate some kind of peace. Unlikely, but possible, with a campaign led by Manstein in what he called the backhand blow, trying to sweep the overconfident Russians away. For we forget just how short of manpower Russia was getting. You can't keep on losing men like this for the entire war. And so Manstein is driving them back. But back in Africa, in March, the 8th Army finally get to that Maref line. On the 6th of March, however, the Axis actually counterattack out of the Maref line. It's an act of insanity. It would have been okay had they attacked as soon as the British arrived at the Maref line. That was the plan. But the Italians weren't keen. It took days for the Germans to persuade the Italians to attack, by which stage the British were ready, and the Germans and Italians attacked straight into a wall of British artillery and anti-tank fire. Not a single British tank was lost. The fields were full of burning German panzers. And then we start to grind our way through Maref. But there are now 350,000 Axis troops in Tunis. And just remember, everyone remembers Stalingrad. They should do. It's a key turning point in the war. 110,000 Germans dead. 350,000 Axis troops in Tunisia. And yet who remembers that now? But it was important. And so they're getting, well, they need 120,000 tons of supplies a day, but they're getting 70,000. Both Rommel and Arnhem want to withdraw from the Maref line. Their front line is 400 miles long. They decide that they'd really like to just fortify a box in front of Tunis, only 100 miles long, but Hitler refuses. On the 9th of March, Rommel leaves Africa in disgust, while Friedenthal is sacked by Eisenhower and replaced by Patton. Monty attacks the Maref line on the 20th, while Patton was to be kept on a very tight leash by General Alexander to stop him getting carried away. The Maref line is incredible. They've built those bunkers on top of sheer cliffs, so you have to climb up sheer cliffs to be able to take the bunkers. It's an amazing work of fortifications. Now, Monty's plan, you may have heard of before. He's going to do a two-pronged attack at night, because it worked before. But with a slight twist, he is going to send an encircling force through the Tebrega Gap to try and trap the Germans and Italians on the Maref line. It's actually guarded by a Roman wall, built in the days of the Roman Empire, and there are some poor Italian boys sat on this wall built by the Roman Empire, and they are guarding the Tebrega Gap. And they have to hold it to stop the Maref line being encircled, because just like the Maginot Line, you can go around. And it's the Tebrega Gap. And so Monty's going to send troops that way. The Americans attack first, a diversionary attack in the north, just try and hold German and Italian troops into place. It goes badly, but they are holding them in place. Unfortunately, the attack on the Maref line also goes badly. Monty had left a general called General Lees in charge, and he decided to lead the attack with these Valentine tanks. They look incredible. They are heavy tanks. They're equipped with only an obsolete 2-pounder anti-tank gun. He should have led the attack with Sherman tanks. He could have done. He had them. But he decided to use these. He could have led the attack with British infantry supported by 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns. That would have worked really well, but he didn't. He led the attack with these, and their guns can't damage most of the German tanks, which is a real disadvantage if you're fighting German tanks. And so they start to, but even so, the British infantry start to grind forwards and ever forwards. And so then you have the concentration on the Tebrega Gap. At one stage, by the way, the British attacking the Maref line used captured German and 88mm anti-aircraft guns. They'll use German anti-aircraft guns, but not their own, to attack German tanks. And that is a real quandary as to why they don't do so. But the Tebrega Gap must fall. And so it's going to be attacked by the New Zealanders under General Freyberg. And initially, the attack goes really well. They take the Roman wall. They drive the Italians back. The Germans and Italians are still in the Maref line. The Italians are fleeing before the New Zealanders. There are no more defences to stop the Germans and Italians being trapped at the Maref line. And the Africa Korps will obviously be destroyed. And this will go down as the great victory of the Maref line. Unfortunately, no. Freyberg decides that actually his troops are pretty tired and that the Germans would expect us to advance at night, so he orders the New Zealanders to stop and rest, which allows the Germans to rush troops to try and support these Italians, and the chance is lost. Eventually, the New Zealanders will continue their attack, and when they do, they will blast through the 21st Panzer, and they will hack through these German troops that are sent to plug the gap, and they fight incredibly well and incredibly bravely. But the chance is lost, and the Germans and the Italians have already abandoned the Maref lines, leaving 21st Panzer to its fate. Now, at this stage, they send another officer to try and tell Hitler to abandon Africa. And so von Luck decides to send a brigadier to try and see Hitler to say, actually, I'm a frontline soldier, I've seen the fighting, we can't win. Hitler refuses to even meet him. But at least he doesn't get sent to a death battalion, so it could have been worse. And so he's refused to see him. Meanwhile, Axis forces prepare to stand at Wadi Akit. At Wadi Akit, you've got the line anchored along some hills, the Fatnasser Hills. And the first unit to reach it are Tucker's 4th Indian. Superbly trained, they're also trained for mountain warfare. But von Lee's attack plan is to try and batter it with Valentine tanks. But Tucker talks him around and goes, actually, could we try something new? Instead of battering them with heavy tanks, why don't we try and sneak into the hills, go round, see how that works? We'll just infiltrate our way through the lines. And he's given permission. At first, Lees goes, no, but Monty actually, in fairness to Monty listens to Tucker's plan and goes, yes, we will give that a plan, and overrules his own General Lees and supports the man who's trying to take his job, which I think speaks very kindly, actually, of Monty, that he's prepared to do that. And so Tucker's 4th Indian start to sneak round through the Fatnasser Hills. He infiltrates and encircles the Italian Panzer Army. And on the 6th of April, he starts to infiltrate through the German Africa Korps as well. And pretty soon, the Axis forces are forced to abandon the front as their forces have been unhinged, I suppose, by this advancing Indian force. And on the 7th of April, the US finally join up with the 8th Army. And both sides start to batter their way through the Van Dyck Pass, but they're repulsed due to their inexperience. Patton is now withdrawn from the front line to prepare for the invasion of Sicily, and is replaced by Bradley. Now, reinforcements continue to rush into the Germans in Tunis, mostly by air. There are 2 massive air convoys a day bringing German troops into Tunis. Some of them, the new Messerschmitt 323s. A lot of them are shot down. On the 16th of April, it's known as the Palm Sunday turkey shoot. 100 German aircraft are bringing in more troops to Tunis. But we know they're coming. And so we meet them with a load of fighters. And we shoot down, out of those 100, 74 of the air transports carrying elite German troops into the Tunis front. The loss of life is absolutely appalling, hence why we call it the turkey shoot. Since March, the Germans have lost 519 aircraft over Tunis. Put that into perspective, over Stalingrad, they had less than 300. They've lost near 520 over Tunis in a month. The Germans have also lost 1,000 aircraft on the ground in the Tunis campaign. And so when we think this is a sideshow, for aircraft losses, the Eastern Front's a sideshow. It's the main front for the army, but Tunis is the main front for the Air Force. And to win an air war, this is how it's going to be done. And the air war is increasingly going against the Axis, especially over Germany. On the 18th of March, a German pilot, Gerhardt, comes up with an intriguing new plan to try and shoot down the massive American bombers. The massive American bombers are covered in machine guns. They're a nightmare for fighters to try and approach. So what Gerhardt does, he attaches little bombs to the bottom of his 109, and he flies above the American bombers and tries to drop bombs onto the bombers, thinking that if they hit, it'll destroy them. I mean, it's a really revolutionary idea. And you know what? It worked. And it killed, it has to be said, 3 of the American bombers and him, because his aircraft was flying too close to the American bombers that he'd bombed. However, I mean, why he thought this would be a good idea, I think combat stress had got to him. However, that although they trial this, they soon abandon it. Even so, the raids get heavier and heavier as Haig begins his all-out bomber offensive on the 2nd of March. He has 400 heavy and 300 medium bombers. The Casablanca Conference had said that he could now start to wipe German cities off the map. Bomber Haig, by the way, he knows that his bombers can't hit accurate targets. Several times, British bombers miss Berlin. So trying to say we'll hit that factory is complete madness. So bomber commanders decided that, do you know what, the Germans started this, so their cities can pay the price. He doesn't care who he kills. His plan is the only good German's a dead one. He doesn't care if they're women, children, which is why often people say he should be done for a war crime. But he's decided he's going to simply he doesn't want British troops to land for D-Day at all. He says it's not necessary. He says that give him enough time, there will be no Germany left. That's his plan for the bomber force. And so raid after raid launches devastating attacks. In one attack, 160 acres of city are destroyed as they attack Essen. 53 buildings of the Krupp Steelworks. Another raid destroys 3,000 houses, damaging another 2,000, leaving 500 dead. On the 14th of March, Operation Chastise, the Dambuster Squadron is created and is sent. Initially, he wasn't keen because it meant removing experienced bomber crews. And he said it was actually better to just keep on bombing German cities. But eventually, he is persuaded and the dams are destroyed. So but it's not just the raids on the dam. On the 26th and 27th of March, they bomb Duisburg. On the 3rd of April, Essen is hit again. On the 8th, Dusseldorf is hit. On the 10th, Frankfurt. On the 14th, Stuttgart. City after city after city are left burning. Berlin is hit again and again and again. One random act of devastation hits a warehouse that happened to be stocked full of cutting art, state-of-the-art radar and radio sets, which Germany simply can't afford to replace. Wave after wave of bombers hitting their cities. And German losses mount and mount and mount. This raid is particularly, however, famous, and rightly so, because these dams were actually famous dams. They'd been big prestige projects of the German government. They were known across Germany when they were bombed. The German government, however, couldn't admit that they'd been blown up by British aircraft, so they blamed Jewish saboteurs and said that they had to try and increase the pace of the Holocaust to stop just things like this, because clearly the work of saboteurs on the ground. This was devastating. The raid on the dams destroyed 12 factories. The factories were simply swept away by a wall of water. Another 91 factories were damaged. 25 road and rail bridges were gone, as was the Dortmund power station. All three had to be repaired before the cities could recover. And as soon as they're repaired, they know the British might just blow them again. So they need to get a load of more troops there with anti-aircraft guns to try and guard these bridges. So they have to find even more guns and more men from somewhere to guard bridges that have already been blown. On the 24th to 25th of May, 800 bombers hit Dortmund, another 2,000 homes gone. And at sea, the Axis II are losing badly. On the 11th to the 16th of May, the battle for convoy ON-55. 12 merchantmen are sunk, but 28 submarines are destroyed to destroy those 12 merchantmen. That's not the way it's meant to work. The Allies are introducing better and better air mines to try and hunt the U-boats. By mid-May, 10 convoys crossed the Atlantic, including 370 merchantmen, and only of these 370, only 6 are sunk. So we're now losing, only around 2% of our merchantmen crossing the Atlantic. To sink these 6 merchantmen, the Germans lose another 13 submarines. So now, approximately, for every merchant ship lost, the Germans will lose 2 submarines. They can't afford this rate of loss. They have lost the U-boat war. That same month, they lose 41 U-boats, including Dönitz's own son, lost in a U-boat. On the 24th of May, the U-boats are withdrawn from the Atlantic. Dönitz says, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." Now there is nothing to stop British supplies flooding into Africa and eventually, of course, into Europe. Now, back in Africa, Alexander was prepared to begin Operation Vulcan, our final stage of this conflict. 8th Army would hold the Axis in place, while 1st Army would advance into Tunis. The Italians held the 8th Army bravely, especially at Tacroma, where the Italians and the Maori fought hand to hand. 8th Army ground its way through the Axis armies, and Bradley led the American 2nd Corps in the fight for Hill 609. After 4 assaults and fierce German counterattacks, the Americans finally take the hill. 8th Army then manages to batter their way through the German lines with the 56th Division, and then follow up with the 6th Indian and the 7th Armoured, the old Western Desert Force. Tucker plans yet another night attack, and this night attack is on a staggering scale. It's called Operation Strike. There is one last defensive line before Tunis. Promise you one. Just give me one. There is Tunis. There are the last German lines. What are we going to do to try and break it? A night assault, obviously, with a massive artillery barrage, because why not? But this is the scale of the barrage. Each piece of British artillery was given 1,000 rounds to fire. 1,000. They are going to drown that German army in explosive force. All the while, the Air Force was going to pound that defensive line. There are waves after waves of bombers. There are 450 artillery pieces pounding the positions. They fire thousands of shells before the Gurkhas are sent in to follow up after the air and artillery assault. Behind the Gurkhas, you have these heavy Churchill tanks that replace the Valentines, ready to be swept into any advance. Daylight rose, and they're still fighting. And for the first time in the war, the British bring forward the 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns, so that when the German tanks counterattack, they're met by those 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns at the Battle of Majada. And they massacre those German tanks. It's a shame we didn't do it about 3 years before, when we could have done. But those anti-aircraft guns prove their worth. And by the end of the day, the German forces along that defensive line have been annihilated. And the road to Tunis is clear. It is probably the best fought battle the British did all war. Because Operation Strike, we were fighting against a highly experienced German army. Those German troops had mostly been in Africa for the duration of the African campaign. They're superbly equipped. They're superbly trained. They're well led. They're dug in. And they are annihilated in the space of a day and a half in a deluge of firepower. It's not flashy. There's no lovely lines on a map to show you where they go, oh, they took the flank here. What it's done by, though, is by sheer firepower and the combatability of Gurkhas. I wouldn't want to be in a trench fighting against a Gurkha, quite frankly. The right men for the right job and using the right piece of equipment. On the 7th of May, Tunis finally falls. On the 8th, Allied aircraft and ships tried to stop the escape of the shattered remnants of this German army. 800 Germans are captured at sea. 250,000 men are captured on land. This is the surrender at Tunis. For every Axis soldier that surrendered at Stalingrad, 2 surrendered at Tunis. Now, admittedly, a lot of them are Italians, but nonetheless, there's a lot of them. It is a crippling defeat. On the 12th of May, von Arnim surrendered to General Tucker, and at 1:16 p.m. on the 13th of May 1943, the war in North Africa was over. Meanwhile, in the east, Germany scraped together what it could. By June 1943, they still had 3 million men in Russia, as Hitler planned his attack on the Kursk salient. The salient is the size of the United Kingdom. Thanks to the Soviet spy Lucy, the same spy who warned the Russians about Barbarossa in 1941, the Soviets know where and when the Germans are coming. Stalin had wanted to go on the offensive first, but his own generals had persuaded him not to, and instead to wait for the Germans to attack. They dug 5 defensive lines, supported by 3,600 tanks. The Germans have 2,700. And so we leave the war with Kursk about to begin. The Germans beaten in North Africa. And now, if ever there was a time for them to surrender, now would be the time. They had no hope of victory when my talk began, but they could dream perhaps of forcing the Allies to negotiate for peace. But with the losses at Stalingrad and the losses of the sadly forgotten Tunisian campaign, now even the hope of forcing the Allies into a negotiated settlement have gone. Their cities are being annihilated. Their 17-year-olds have already been pressed into uniform, and things will only now get worse. Thank you.